members are absent. I haven't had a message of any trouble logging on. Oh, hi, Debbie. Can we do an audio check?
Hello, good evening.
Great. And letting in our third one. So, council is all present, Mayor, and FCC TV is live, and you're ready to go. And I can do the notice and do roll call when you're ready.
I'm ready. Let's get started.
All right. The meeting for which this agenda has been posted will be held pursuant to and in compliance with the Virginia Freedom of Information Act, Section 2.2-3708.2, and state and local legislation adopted to allow for continued government operations during the COVID declared emergency. All participating members of City Council and other boards will be present at this meeting through electronic means, and members of the public can view the meeting at www.fallschurchva.gov/council meetings, as well as on FCC TV channels Cox 11, RCN 2, and Verizon 35. City Council work sessions are conducted to allow council members to discuss upcoming legislation and policy issues, and the public is generally not invited to speak. However, public comment may be sent to cityclerk@fallschurchva.gov. All comments are provided in full to the members of council and will be summarized at the next regular meeting. And with that, for roll call, Ms. Connolly?
Here.
Mr. Duncan?
Yes, here.
Ms. Hardy?
Here.
Ms. Hiscott?
Here.
Mr. Lickenhouse?
Here.
Mr. Snyder?
Here.
And Mayor Tarter.
Here.
Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. And welcome to everyone. Welcome to our Monday, June 21st, 2021 work session of the Falls Church City Council. We're pleased you're all able to join us this evening. Let's go ahead and get started with things unless there's any preliminary matters anyone wants to discuss. Why don't we move on to our first item, which is the review of new state laws. And I understand, Ms. Mester, you're going to be leading this discussion?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I do want to acknowledge that we have with us this evening for the meeting Lindsay Martinez, who has been working with the city as an intern through the ICMA Veterans Local Government Management Fellows Program, and has been a great resource to us on many fronts, but also for this evening, I want to highlight the great work she did in researching the status of all the bills that we reported on in this report, as well as drafting and repairing the report. It was extremely beneficial for the city and for myself, as we're also working ARPA and all the federal issues, as you all are well aware of. So much appreciation to Lindsay. This report is our third year of tradition of trying to report back out on the General Assembly sessions. This year, of course, was challenging and unique because we had a regular session and a special session. And beginning of August, looks like August 2nd, we will have the second special session of 2021 that we'll report on later. It is predominantly to be on the ARPA allocation of the state funding. We are hearing that's the primary focus, but there may be some ancillary things that are introduced. As part of the report today, I wanted to highlight, as we did when you adopted the legislative program, that we reviewed bills throughout the session with the equity lens in mind so that we could respond and support or not support as appropriate if there had impacts on vulnerable populations, protected classes, or disparate impacts. One thing I will note before talking a little bit about the bills, that we did catch a typo on page 11 of the full report related to Senate Bill 1271. It was just a cut and paste. So we will repost the corrected version, and I do have that one on display for this evening. It just clarified for public meetings what the actual change of the legislation was. The format of the report is similar as we've done in the past years, where we've given you executive summary of some of the key bills that we tracked throughout the session, and then provided a little bit more in-depth for each of them. I'm not going to do all 20 pages today, and this, of course, is not even all of the bills, but they were key ones that we tracked during the session. I do appreciate the work of the Legislative Committee. This session, having regular meetings with our 3 committee members, was helpful to keep a focus on our prioritization. We will use the Legislative Committee function as we prepare for our General Assembly session 2022, which actually I had my first NOVA Legislative Liaisons meeting today, so we have kicked that off. And we will plan to invite Senator Sassel and Delegate Simon to join council at a meeting in the early fall as they're putting together their prioritizations, their caucus priorities, and council is working on their priorities. So that's sort of the plan as we go forward. Looking at lines 43 is where the executive summary starts in the staff report. And as noted, we've highlighted a few of the key bills. A lot of these are work in progress with key staff looking to follow up for implementation. One example is the new overtime bill that just was approved and goes into effect July 1. Steve Mason and the HR team are making sure that our policies and practice are aligned with that as it relates to non-exempt employees. Marijuana legalization is going to be a big one in terms of working with recreational use now being allowed, retail sales being in the future, but that would not be till 2024, and the legislation has to be reenacted or readopted in its exact form. And also there is state and local taxing authority on retail sales. For the retail at the local level, the city and council will need to decide whether to allow retail sales or not and do a referendum. And actually the May BML Town and Country magazine has an excellent detailed article on that starting on page 26 that gives a great summary of all the components. There are some issues that will have to be worked through because the Virginia state law does not align with federal law, which is an issue for many states. A lot of legislation was around elections this past year to allow for easier access to voting, absentee voting year-round for registration, and a lot of timing of when the primaries would be and changing it so it doesn't conflict as much with schools. For many localities, they'll have a bigger impact than the city because the local elections are mandated to move to November, and that's one that the city of Falls Church had done previously. Dave Berkey is closely tracking all of those legislative bills with our local electoral board and the state to make sure those are implemented properly. One item that is under line 76, which can seem small, that we got it fixed, but I think it has a very important outcome, and that was on dangerous weapons. As council will recall, we were allowed to prohibit by ordinance dangerous weapons on public property, and that was for owned buildings or land. It excluded in the original bill last year leased property, so the school board central office could not have the same policy in that office space as in schools and our buildings. So that was a correction in this last General Assembly. There was a lot of discussion and legislation and work around sovereign immunity, qualified immunity. All of those bills did fail last year. I do anticipate we'll see them again in 2022, and this will have an impact on our ability to retain and recruit police officers, as we've talked about during this session, as well as potential for financial liability on individuals and the locality. So we're going to be tracking that very closely. On the positive front, there was a lot more money put into stormwater. And so we're looking at those grant opportunities now. There's also to be a working group established to look at the criteria for which some of those grants are awarded, so they can be both quality and quantity of criteria and not just quality. That working group is not yet stood up. It was Delegate Plum's bill and the initiative, and because of the change of his service in the General Assembly, we're not quite sure if it'll be stood up this summer or not. Lindsay was coordinating with Alexandria, who was our partner and lead on these legislations, and they've put in a formal letter to Delegate Plum to request that the work group be stood up. And that would be my recommendation to council, that on your behalf, I submit that. It would be consistent with your legislative position. And I think before opening it up to just questions and comments from the legislative committee, I would like to highlight that there's a crosswalk study group that is the result of one of the bills that we successfully got delayed from being enacted, so that we could really work on maintenance of crosswalks, construction of crosswalks that are ADA compliant within safe standards that are adopted in state code, and also consistent with localities guidance. Like here, your streetscape standards call for brick. The bill as originally drafted would have precluded that and overrode localities' adopted policies or even historic districts. So that one we're going to be working really closely on as the work group stands up. We also, for street safety, as you all know, got local control for our speed limits now. And so Public Works is starting to work on that along with the CACT for reducing our speed limits, whether that might be down to 20 or 15. Too low is actually more of a safety hazard, so we want to have a good community dialogue. And then we'll bring back some recommendations to council. There will be a cost associated with this, as we need to swap out any speed limit signs that are changed. But that was a very positive outcome to get that back to local control. And as council knows, this becomes an issue quite often during the NTC programs. There was also some legislation supporting preserving trees and allowing localities to exceed some of the tree replacement requirements as part of your ordinances and redevelopments. So I know the Urban Forestry Commission will be tracking that, and Lindsay has been coordinating that with our new arborist so they can review that. And with that, I'm glad to pause. There's a lot there, and be glad to hear any other comments from council members or questions, and Lindsay is here to help me answer those.
All right. Well, thank you for the information you provided so far. Thank you to Lindsay as well for your fine work. Are there any questions or comments? Looks like the first one is from Ms. Hardy. Letty?
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, the mute button is quite slow again. Thank you, Cindy and Lindsay. Really nice, thorough staff reports. I appreciate all the detail in this. I guess I'll start with the firearm one. Now that that loophole is closed for school board owned or leased property, besides, do we need to do anything, or is it really school board passing an ordinance to make that happen?
That'll be the school board's action.
Okay. So if they don't know about it already, let's get it over to them. Thank you. On the transportation ones, I think you mentioned the speed limit and the speed cameras one, which I know this council has been very keen on being able to do something about sooner than later. So I look forward to the CACT recommendations on that. There was also 2 pieces of bike legislation that some bike advocates have been excited about. So for the purpose of the public, one is to allow bikes to ride side by side in the lane. And then the second is for cars to be required to change lanes in order to pass bikes. So those are both good safety measures, I think, especially if you are riding together as a family, you want to be able to ride side by side in the lane, and just making sure that cars are being respectful of bicyclers who might be using a share or a regular lane. Tree preservation. I think I read in the staff report that it requires a reenactment, so the General Assembly has to pass it again in 2022 in order for us to have more stringent requirements for replacement and canopy. Is that correct?
Yes, that's my understanding, and a work group in between.
Do we need to provide any sort of input on what we'd like to see or get together with our colleagues? Because I know that this really matters for things like stormwater. We would love to get more stringent on tree replacement and canopy requirements, especially if it helps us with stormwater up here.
Yes, I'll keep that on the note. Right now, our arborist is looking into it and the urban forestry, and this is one prior to General Assembly, we coordinated with Arlington quite a bit, and Alexandria. Arlington just brought on their new legislative liaison as of July 19th, so we'll be following up and can circle back to the legislative committee and council as a whole.
Great. And then the last one, environment, is I think the banning of use of single-use styrofoam for takeout containers. But I know that the effective dates, I think it wasn't until 2023 for large chains and then further out for small businesses. That might be worth getting out to our small businesses sooner than later, just so people can be prepared via the chamber in case there's any contracts or things they need to start thinking about now.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you. Nice work.
Mr. Snyder?
Thanks. Well, yeah, it has been a busy legislative session for sure. Cindy, could you tell us a little bit more about this upcoming special session? What are they going to be doing, and what's our role in it?
The legislation or the agenda is predominantly to be on ARPA funding, the state portion of the the federal relief funding. The state is receiving a significant chunk of money that could be allocated to meet and respond to the pandemic. And so in broad sense, I'm hearing from like the press release they did several weeks ago, they'll look at rental assistance, mortgage assistance, utility, the vulnerable populations that are at risk of evictions, looking at more testing, vaccination, any kind of mitigation. Then they'll be looking at broadband as one big area and some economic development. We are waiting to hear, there's a lot of discussions between the money committee chairs and the governor for what will be proposed. The governor will present a budget for the General Assembly to deliberate on during this special session. That we haven't seen anything specific on. I do think a fair amount of the discussion based on the meeting that Lindsay and I participated in today with the NOVA legislation, there'll be a focus on funding for mental health needs, one-time funding for crisis intervention, Marcus alerts, some of the system setups, and then hopefully in regular session, more advocacy for ongoing funding for the mental health. But the ARPA money can be used for that. One thing to be clear on, the General Assembly will have to act on our non-entitled local money that's passed through from them. But as we have seen from the administration and confirmed from Secretary Lane, they're going to still get out the money to us and inform the General Assembly that they're, going to get our local money to us within the 30 days. But technically, the General Assembly will have to appropriate that. So we will see language about their appropriation, but they're not delaying distributing our money. There is potential for other things to be brought forward, but I know the governor's intent is to try to keep it focused on ARPA and ARPA COVID related, and all other things should wait to the 2020 session. That didn't happen the last special session, as we know, so we'll have to keep our antennas up.
So thanks, Cindy. I'm wondering if, I might call a legislative committee meeting sometime before that session when you know more information and any positioning we need to do, any correspondence, any advocacy on behalf of our citizens and our interests. So thanks for that. A great interest in the speed limit bill and how soon we can implement the reduction in speed limits in the city of Falls Church. And finally, I know there were a lot of electric vehicle sort of infrastructure bills and studies and things. So, we don't need to go into it tonight. I think we ought to play a role in some of those larger studies, particularly of electric vehicles and the application of technology. So that may be a subject for a legislative session and another report back to the City Council and the public. Thank you very much, Cindy.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Snyder.
All right, any other comments? All right, Cindy, if you got more, give it to us.
That's what I have for the legislative report this evening. I will note that transportation will certainly be a hot topic for 2022, making sure we come out of COVID and get all the omnibus funding that we were supposed to, and working to restore MVTA. So that's what I have for this evening, Mayor, on the legislative program.
All right, well, thank you for that. That's very informative. We appreciate you taking the time to speak with us about it and keeping us informed. I know there's a lot good that's going to happen later on, so keep your antenna up and keep letting us know what's going on. But thank you. Let's move on now to the quarterly report of the use of force recommendations from the committee. Mr. Shields, who's going to be handling that?
We have Chief Gavin, who's in the meeting with us, and she will provide this report.
All right, welcome. Thank you, Chief.
Good evening, Council. Thank you for having us. One, I'm just going to give a quick summary. You have the report before you for more details, but again, I just wanted to reemphasize the importance of this work plan that was provided by the community. And I also wanted just to highlight, you know, the Falls Church Police weren't caught flat-footed in police reform. We've been engaged in the 21st century policing principles since 2015 when that first came out under the Obama administration. But from, as you are aware, from the Use of Force Committee's studies over 6 months, they came up with 10 very solid recommendations for the police department and the sheriff's office to follow for police reform within the city. I'm only going to really highlight 3 here tonight because the others will follow. The 3 that I wanted to highlight were the 1st, the 2nd, and the 9th. And essentially why is because they established a foundation as to how we're going to move forward through this work plan. And the first one is essentially defining core values specific to police and the culture of, you know, how we guide the use of force. And the police department established a police reform group within the police department to look at, one, our mission, our vision. We did not have core values, and that's what the committee was wanting us to focus on. So I met with this group on June 9th. They've come up with a first draft and had some good revisions for suggestions. They're going to take it back, do some more work on those, and we should have those out by the fall of 2021. And that kind of will establish some of the core, I guess, principles of government service we should look to when we're training officers, when we're evaluating officers, and or how we are just reviewing our use of force guidelines. The second was to improve oversight and ensure transparency and accountability. You know, these recommendations are recommendations we can use daily for continual improvement. And I would dare say for improving oversight, we obviously have before us in the next 6 months is the body-worn camera program. And that will be an initiative that will be introduced to the community first. We're getting our feet on the ground. Obviously, we have been awarded a grant through the Commonwealth, and we're working through the process of procurement. We have a policy, but that will be integrated with our in-car camera system. And the Falls Church Police have had an in-car camera system for over 15 years. So that will be a next big step for us. The next 3 on that list is essentially there are legislative changes, much like what Cindy has been talking about, that have pushed all police departments into doing things differently and or collecting data. And these are heavy lifts. These are things that we are doing daily to ensure that we're in compliance and looking at data platforms. on Monday, there will be a press release between Falls Church Police, Fairfax City Police, and Alexandria Police. And we are the first in the Commonwealth that will be engaged in what they call the My90 survey. And it's a survey tool that allows for the community member that is stopped in a traffic stop to provide survey data back to the My90 company. And essentially what this company is doing with the data is they're looking at ways to create a platform for collecting data so that the Community Policing Act can be fulfilled, that we can ensure that we have accountability for our stops, particularly as it relates to race. So I'm excited about that. The third one is the police department is working with the Commonwealth Attorney's Office to ensure that we are in compliance with a new legislative change that takes a deep look at all practices of an officer throughout their whole career. And that too is somewhat of a heavy lift. I'm working with Carol's office and Human Resources to make sure that we're doing right by all of the rules, the laws of Human Resources, and what the Commonwealth Attorney needs. And lastly, on this bullet point is that the police department has joined what we call a critical incident response team. Over 11 jurisdictions within this Northern Virginia region have convened a task force of sorts. So if there's ever a critical incident in any one of these 11 jurisdictions, this core of investigators will come and give a neutral investigation to the use of force to provide to the Commonwealth Attorney. So it feels as if, or it may feel as if that, you know, with a neutral party investigating, let's just say one of our officers, you would feel assured that there's no bias and that the Commonwealth is getting all of the facts. And we would be part of that team, so our investigators would go out and assist on other jurisdictions. We're very excited about that. There was a press release, I believe, in January about this. One of our captains, Sonia Richardson, who just happens to be retiring this week, was one of the people that stood this up and assisted in the development of this. And then lastly, I just wanted to touch base on implementing systems that facilitate managing policies and procedures, number 9. Why I think this one is so important, and probably one of the most important recommendations, is it establishes a management system for policies and procedures. In the city, we have done this piecemeal, and the system and contract that we've established with Lexipol is a public safety municipal policy vendor. And what they do is they update policies for police departments in as a team with the police department. But what happens with this contract is with every federal change, with every state change, with every accreditation change, the policies are automatically updated. Training is sent out to each and every officer for a clear understanding as to what's going on with the ever-changing world of police reform. So I think that will establish a great baseline for us. Rather than us chasing all these legislative changes, it's an automatic update, and it's an automatic retraining to the officers, which is most beneficial. And lastly, under that bullet point, there is we have contracted with Adagel Law Services, which gives you up-to-date law changes or case law changes for officers, so they can look at case law throughout the United States and be up to date. So I think those are the 3 core ones I'd like to highlight. The other ones you can peruse, and if you have any questions, I'm here to answer any questions that you may have on any of the recommendations.
All right, thank you so much. That's very helpful. We do have a question, and I'm sorry, is that you, Ms. Hiscott?
It is. I just had a quick question on the Lexipol. Is that something that you then subscribe to moving forward so it continues to update state and federal policy? It says in completion of October 2021, but I assume it's something that you we'd subscribe to continue to receive?
Yeah, yes, good question. Essentially what it is we subscribe to it every year at a cost of, I think it's approximately $12,000. And what they do is they provide, like I said, the updates, the training, and the professional attorneys and or discipline experts for any questions we may have in terms of change of policy. The overall anticipated completion of our whole general order manual will be in October 2021. We're completely redoing the whole manual. So that's where we anticipate the completion in October 21. It's being done in 5 phases. The first 2 are the most high risk and liability type issues. You're talking about use of force, detaining or seizing people or property. Those type of policies are the first tier. The second tier, you get into more, maybe traffic stops or handling weapons. And then as you get into the 3rd and 4th and 5th tiers, it's more personnel type things that may not be at the highest risk. So, yeah, so we will have a continual subscription to Lexipol.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Lichtenhouse?
Thanks, Chief. Thank you as always. 2 questions, both related to the body-worn cameras. The first, I recall my first year on council going through budget, asking you a question about body-worn cameras. And I remember that you very confidently said, the in-vehicle camera systems that we have set up, the record of interactions, you felt was sufficient. So aside from what's happened here on a national level and some of the pressure around accountability and transparency, what has changed? And if you answered this question during budget session, I apologize, but what has changed in your mind that now necessitates us to wear or have our officers wear body-worn cameras?
I would say that the community's expectations have changed, not only locally, but I think regionally and nationally. I think there is an insatiable need to have the information in a non-biased in a pictured way or video type way. The other thing that we're finding is a lot of the court cases are demanding video. And if you don't have video, it's almost as if it didn't exist. So you start to see trends where we cannot get successful prosecutions and or there is doubt based on just an officer writing a report anymore. The difference between the in-car camera and the body-worn camera, well, one, these 2 systems will work together because they're from the same vendor and they have some of the same cues in terms of when they're turned on, when they're turned off, when they're activated. So that will be very helpful. The other thing is we already have an internal system that supports the in-car camera, so the body-worn camera is just a nice add. I think most importantly, I think the community has different expectations than they did 5 years ago. I think they have different expectations than they did a year ago. And I think the officers have a desire to show the work that they're doing. When police started first being videotaped back in the Rodney King days, it was just one of those things that, wow, it was a surprise. And as officers started getting videotaped more and more, my position to that was to them, this is a First Amendment right. Everyone has the right to videotape us doing our job, and we should not ever deter somebody from their First Amendment right. And so I think what you find now is the officers too want to show you their service. And in the case of body-worn cameras, what you're finding is less and less escalation in force, because one, people know they're being videotaped, both the officer and or the subject before them. And so, I hate to say it, but unfortunately it's become part of a best practice. And I think the expectations are demanding it at this point.
Okay, now that certainly answers my question, and it was exactly what I had hoped for. It was nothing specific here in Falls Church, but just a response to the changing in times and the expectations and transparency. And as always, I think your responses are great and should be very reassuring to folks here in the community. My second question related to body-worn cameras, from an administrative perspective, and forgive my naivety in this question, but is there a FOIA responsibility for collecting that footage? Is it only accessible as part of a court order or deposition or exchange of evidence for a particular court case?
That is going to be one of our challenges, the FOIAs of the videos, and that's also administrative cost, not only to Celeste and her office, our office, but the Commonwealth attorneys. All of this video has to be stored. If someone requested it, all records, reports, files regarding an investigation, depending on the status of the investigation, is where we go and look at the Library of Virginia's rulings and standards in and around that. You know, that's going to be something that's going to be tested. If it's under investigation or something that's pending, that's obviously something we can hold on to. If not, we're going to have to look at some type of software which comes with this package that you can redact, you know, some faces and or voices of victims or somebody that is not subject to being exposed.
Okay.
So we're going to have to study up on that.
Okay. Yeah, I was afraid that you would say that, but I think everyone is probably aware that you know, with the collection of this data and how we manage it, it's going to require more of an administrative burden. So we should expect that additional resources, whether it's technology or otherwise, is going to be necessary to comb and sift through this and respond to FOIA requests and how we manage this data from a cybersecurity perspective too, because that information can be quite sensitive. But it's the changing tide of the times, and it's something that we should expect. So I appreciate that response, Chief. Thank you so much. That's all I have.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to your question is that, you know, in terms of changing times, it will probably be a mandatory tool of the trade from the Commonwealth. And we were fortunate enough, Steve Rao, Captain Rao, had applied for a grant and got us a 50-50 match for the amount of money that we needed. So it is getting ahead of the game because it's coming. It's going to be probably state mandated.
So a central repository of sorts, maybe managed at the state level to some extent?
No, I'm saying I'd say each department's going to be mandatory that we wear body-worn cameras. As far as the depository of video, it's going to be up to the jurisdiction to manage that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so our burden to bear. All right. Thanks, Chief.
All right, Ms. Hardy.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Chief, for joining us. I appreciate kind of our first quarterly update on this, and in the spirit of kind of continuous improvement, giving us follow-ups and keeping us accountable for all of this. And actually, before we jump into it, just a note of kudos for your force. I really appreciate the both compassionate and proactive outreach that your team did around our Asian American businesses in light of the hate that we were seeing across the country and being proactive with our businesses. So thank you for that. I did hear from positive feedback from the Eden Center about appreciating that outreach. My questions are also about body-worn cameras. What do we expect will be the on-the-ground kind of launch date? When will all of our officers be outfitted with one?
I can estimate it's going to be 3 to 6 months from now. And I say that because, you know, the policy is done. Obviously, the grant has been awarded. Procurement is in process, but everyone now is asking for them. And the vendor is suggesting that, you know, in terms of manufacturing, it may be a little slower than we anticipated. I mean, they've been very supportive because we are a customer with their in-car camera, so that's helpful. And because we have an established infrastructure within the department with that tool, we're in a good place. But I will tell you, everyone's trying to get them now. And because of that, I think we are thinking it's going to be 3 to 6 months.
Okay. So in the meantime, I think along the lines of Ross's questions, I think the policies governing the usage will be important and important to also share with the community. So,
Yes.
you know, when will officers be required to turn them on? When are they allowed to turn them off? Retention requirements, privacy. I think those are all probably valuable to have as a community conversation before the launch date, so people are aware this is something that we're doing, and here's how we want to, you know, let people know this is going to be happening. So people can, you know, again, engage with it, given that there was high interest before. So maybe kind of the next quarterly update, we can talk about the details of what we expect those policies to look like.
Certainly.
Great. Thank you very much.
All right. Any other comments or questions? If not, thank you, Chief, and thank you all to all the others who've been involved in this. This is very important work, and we greatly appreciate it. Let's move on now to T1. Who's handling this, Mr. Stoddard, Mr. Snyder?
Mr. Stoddard will give the staff report on this item, and I believe Mr. Stoddard will do so.
All right.
Let's see. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mayor Tarter, members of council. Thank you, Wyatt. And actually, I think Susan Bell, who is the chief author of the report, is on the line. Has been doing most of the research for this. So I'm actually going to flip the staff report over to her if she is on.
I'm on.
Great. Thank you, Susan. Just by way of brief introduction before I turn it over to you for the narrative, just to make sure council's aware, this is a first conversation on this item. I know there were some comments from the community that came in, and maybe some folks are thinking that this is moving too fast or they're not clear on the details. And that's actually why we're having this work session tonight, is that there was some direction from council to explore opportunities for diversity of housing types in the city. Staff has been doing some of that groundwork, and before we want to proceed into the details, we want to check in with council to confirm if this is something that you want us to explore further, and perhaps identify key groups and stakeholders that we should be checking in with along the way. But with that, I'll turn it over to Susan Bell.
Thank you, Paul. Good evening, Mr. Mayor and members of the council. As you know, the T1 and T2 zoning districts have the purpose of creating a transitional zone between more intense mixed-use development and lower density residential development. As of about 2005, this zone comprised less than 3% of the land area in the city, and I believe that number has actually been reduced since that time. Today, T1 is located primarily on Washington Street and on Park Avenue, and existing uses include the Columbia Baptist Church, Christ Crossman Methodist Church, Sunrise of Falls Church, several houses that have been converted to commercial use, some residential townhouses, and there are some vacant parcels. T2 zoning is limited to North Washington and Park Avenue near Maple, and is developed with the Kaiser Permanente facility and a small office building. It is by far the smaller land area of the two T districts. But both T1 and T2 permit very similar uses, with the sole difference between the two districts being that T1 also permits by right 1- and 2-family dwellings as regulated in R1B and townhouses as regulated in RTH. One of the things that we're considering in our discussion tonight is whether or not 1- and 2-family dwellings should be eliminated from the T zones, in part because there are ample opportunities elsewhere in the city for such uses to be created. Neither of the T zones currently allow multifamily dwellings. Now, building heights and requirements and yard requirements are very similar in T1 and T2, and it's for this reason, with the uses being so similar and the bulk and placement requirements being so similar, that we're recommending that the two zones be combined. Now, one of the things we really were set out to do was to look at options for developing a residential-only project. That was the direction to us back when the SE criteria were amended at the end of February. And as you know, you can do an all-residential project in RM, but that doesn't fit within the transitional zone areas currently. You can do an all-residential project in the B zones, but you have to have 75% of the units affordable to low and moderate income households. T1 has townhouses by reference, as I previously mentioned, and then you have RTH. None of those really fits the need for an infill zoning category or for the areas between the mixed-use developments and the single-family residential. So in developing the proposed elements for discussion this evening, I have looked at zoning regulations from a number of jurisdictions that have these transitional districts and talked to several developers who have done these kinds of projects in Alexandria, in Arlington, and Falls Church, trying to kind of get the parameters of issues that they would want to have considered, looking at the elements that might make sense. One of the facts of the T1 zoning that exists today is that many of the sites are quite small. Many of them are less than half an acre, quite honestly, and assembly is not always a viable option. So as we come to you tonight, we have three things that we're working on. One is the consolidation of T1 and T2 into a single transitional district. Second is removal of 1 and 2 family dwellings as permitted uses in the T1 zone. And then the third would be adding multifamily residential as a new use. Now, as you probably recall from the message we received today, the county attorneys reaffirmed that we cannot require condominium over rental use, but we can devise parameters for how that use might be constructed. So the proposed intent and purpose of this combined zone would be to help diversify housing options in the city, respond to changing household sizes, recognize that a high-quality infill residential development could create an effective and, quite honestly, a desirable transition between mixed-use commercial development and lower-density residential. We are looking to consolidate the T1 or the T-zoned properties for infill. And again, as I mentioned, most of these sites are quite small. So some of the standards that we've been discussing would be existing zoning of T1 or T2, maximum height to be allowed of 4 stories or 45 feet with the potential of a step back at the 4th level to help affect the transition. A front yard setback from the street of 15 feet and 20 feet on the T2 zones fronting on Broad or Washington, but eligible for reduction during the review process. And that really would primarily be Washington Street. Side yards of 10 feet, but an eligibility for reduction, again, for a context-sensitive analysis. Maximum of 50% coverage for buildings and parking, so that would be total coverage. And the current T limit is 40%. 10-foot landscape buffer, but it could be reduced consistent with any reduction that was granted for side yards. A minimum of 1 parking space per dwelling unit, with the spaces either compact or tandem, and also with the option for locating within 500 feet off-site and secured by easement. And then in the event the building was a condominium project, no occupant could acquire or be allocated, in the case of a rental project, more spaces than the number provided for their unit. The goal being that we don't want people buying up or renting all the spaces for a car collection or something, and then others can't rent them themselves. We would like to see low-impact design techniques. If there is common area, it should be managed through some sort of an association to ensure adequate maintenance and upkeep. We're recommending also consistency with the affordable living policy and urban design and streetscape policies. And then in terms of a review process, the current thinking would be a site plan approval by the Planning Commission as regulated under the site plan rules. And with that, I think I'll stop talking, and I'll be glad to hear your feedback and respond to any questions you might have.
All right, let's open it up to questions and comments. Mr. Snyder?
Sure. Thank you very much. For some questions, I note in the staff report lines 26 through 32, you outline generically who you've spoken with. Can you give me a list of specifically, particularly with regard to developers?
Sure. I spoke with Rita Bamberger, who is an executive vice president with the Holiday Corporation. They developed Whittier Place. I spoke with Frank Poley of BCN. I'm familiar with his work both in Arlington and other places. And I also spoke with Bob Young of the Young Group so far. Those are the only three I've spoken to thus far.
Okay. And all of them, as I understand it, would not be disqualified from attempting to develop any of these sites. Is that your view?
I'm not sure how you mean disqualified. You mean because they've provided input?
Yeah.
I think really none of these is a mirror image of something that they've described. I really was soliciting input in order to understand what some of the considerations are that would be of paramount interest to them from a land use perspective, from a design perspective. And I can assure you that most of the things that we're talking about currently would not satisfy all three of those parties.
Right, but what you're saying is you approach developers, they gave you advice, and they would still be able to potentially build.
I believe that would not be an impediment
Right.
at all.
Thanks. What other materials have you relied upon? You can give me a list of that. I don't need to take time tonight, but I'm interested in studies and materials. The reason why I'm so interested in this is probably next to budgeting. Zoning is one of the most sensitive things that we do. I want to go to the question I think Paul Stoddard asked about stakeholders. I think we've already begun to hear from our citizens about questions. One of the things I'd be interested in is a compilation of all the properties that abut these T zoning areas and that would potentially be affected, and how we reach out specifically to those affected as well as to the general community. I know when you're, for example, CACT, when they do work that's highly specific to a location, they reach out to the local community. So I think one thing I'm interested in is how we're going to approach the folks that might be most directly affected adjoining those areas. The next question I have is you're talking about potentially consolidating. So how big would one or more of these properties be, and how extensive could the development be in a T area? Again, you don't need to answer that specifically tonight, but I'm very interested in what it is that the real world impact of what you're proposing is what I'm really interested in, particularly generally with regard to our policies, but more specifically with regard to those who are living in a particular area under the assumption, the reasonable assumption that things would not change. It's one thing if you move into an area and complain about conditions you move into. It's another situation where the city may make a change that could affect you. So what I want to make sure is that our citizens, A, know exactly the potential real world impacts generally and on them, and have an opportunity to become comfortable with whatever it is we ultimately come out with. And I note a lot of specificity, 4 stories. That seems to me either too high or too low, depending on what your perspective is. And so I have a lot of questions about the specific standards that you're proposing, where they came from and why that, as opposed to something else. I also note significant lot coverage. How does this square with our tree canopy ordinance? I want to know more about the environmental impacts, because I think a lot of these T zones are not heavily developed now. And if we develop them, are we creating stormwater problems? Because remember, that's one thing we're concerned about. So I have environmental questions. I have questions about making sure that people directly affected, as well as the general public, are fully aware of this, have an opportunity to weigh in, so that whatever we come up with has as broad community buy-in as possible. Hopefully this initial reaction is helpful to you, Susan, and to you, Paul. You did ask about stakeholders and reaching out. I think that outreach will be tremendously important to the entire community, but also to those who are living next to a T and have some reasonable expectations that there won't be a large-scale building right next to them. And I think you've already heard some concern from some of our citizens. So the objective here is to get something that actually works but works in terms of public acceptance as well as theoretically works. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Vice Mayor Connolly.
Susan, thanks for this. It definitely is worth thinking about a little bit further.
Yeah.
As I looked at the map, there weren't a ton of properties that were T1 or T2, but they are, a lot of them are sensitive in that they're bordering residential areas. One of the things on here is that the height limit is 45 feet, which is 4 stories. And what's the height limit on a single family home? 35 feet?
35, yes.
Yes. So it's, and then what is there was a step back. What does that mean exactly?
What I was envisioning was that at the top story, the 4th story, the top floor would actually have an area that is stepping back. So, you know, it may sound like it's designing to a flat roof, but it would be it could be an open deck. It could be just a design feature that reduces it and creates a better taper toward the single family neighborhood.
Okay. So that's something worth exploring a little further as well, because the houses that are being built now are 35 feet and they are 4 stories tall, you know, with basements, and those are single family homes. So I'm wondering how big an actual multi-family home would be as far as an opportunity to put in affordable housing as well. And then I do share Mr. Snyder's concern about tree canopy and allowing more of a lot to be cut. I feel like we're in an epidemic now of, maybe we're just, it's been happening for so long we're almost immune to it, but large trees being cut down because of a lot coverage. And I'm wondering if there's any way to legislate not being able to cut down as many large trees if we were to go ahead with this. And then I also share his concern just about the neighbors, and it would be great to be able to, because it's so few properties, for the department to reach out to all of those neighbors and find out, you know, what they're thinking on this and how it would affect each different property. And then the side yard thing is kind of tricky to me sometimes, because side yards often are yards that you don't expect to be side yards, right? Because they're on corners. So if there's a house that is facing a corner, its backyard is actually considered a side yard if it could have been facing the other way. So I wonder about that too, is if you're talking about reducing side yards to less than 10 feet, that would make me a little bit nervous because of the way that things happen on corners.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions, comments? Letty, are you trying to make a comment?
Yeah, I had my hand raised, but I don't know whether it worked.
Okay. All right. It works now. So
okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. So I also welcome this conversation. I appreciate staff kind of following up on this since we modernized SC a couple months ago. So I do think it's a natural continuation. As it talks about kind of our goals and, you know, the lack of affordable housing, I think that one is obvious, but I think the lack of diverse housing is another one that I think hopefully this can tackle. Just at my office hours today, we did discuss kind of this T1 zoning, but in the same breath, we also talked about how there's no 2 to 3 bedroom size condos, that missing middle housing in the city, and not a lot of options for people downsize into from those single family homes. And I think this is kind of what it's trying to get to. So while I can totally understand the concerns around setbacks, I do think that it's important for us to think about that diverse housing and how this could address it. My 2 questions were actually similar to Mary Beth's around setbacks and stormwater requirements. I do think that especially those rear yard setbacks will be key. And so maybe for the next conversation, what will be helpful for me to be better educated is to look at the proposed kind of changes to T1 and how that actually compares to R1A and R1B. So exactly that question, because we actually have a 3.5 story feels like house being built on Spring Street right now. And it is very tall. And so it doesn't actually feel that much shorter than say 45 feet. And so it'd be interesting to know kind of what's currently allowed in R1A and R1B, how this compares to current T1 and what's proposed for T1. And again, thinking about what that natural transition and buffer is. Clearly, we want to be respectful to those R1A and R1B neighborhoods, but given that what's getting built based on economics is already pretty tall and big, I think the alternative is, 1 to 2 large homes in these T1 lots. I think it's important for people to realize that. So that's kind of my first request. My second one is around stormwater. My understanding is on R1 and R1B, we have requirements of, I think it's 25% building coverage and then 35% impervious coverage. Is that correct?
Paul, I'm not quite up to speed.
That is correct.
Okay, and then I think what's proposed for T1 is 40% lot coverage. Would that cover all impervious surfaces as well?
What we were proposing actually was 50, and that would be all impervious surfaces for buildings, vehicular movement, and parking.
Okay, so given that we are looking at that, I would like to see whether we can be more stringent on the stormwater requirements. If we do want to allow more coverage, whether we prescribe more stringent stormwater retention and or tree canopies beyond what we're doing. Because again, I'd hate for us to go backwards on that. But in general, I'm supportive of the concept and the conversation. I just do think I need more education on how all these setbacks work relative to other zoning and then the stormwater requirement. Thank you.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Ms. Hiscott?
Echoing a lot of what my colleagues have said before me, I have those similar questions. And then we did receive a question today, I believe, it was via email from businesses concerned about losing small business territory and affordable businesses. So I just want to make sure they're included in the group of people that we're talking to when we continue this process. In addition to the neighbors that would be impacted, are there small businesses that would be negated or perhaps want to be involved in mixed use someplace else? Just want to consider them as well, in addition to the neighbors. Thank you.
Mr. Lichtenhouse?
So yeah, I've welcomed this conversation, and I will tell you, it's kind of like I know the cake that I want to eat, but I don't know necessarily how to make it. But from an affordable housing perspective, or I should say diversified housing perspective, I do know that there's opportunity here in T1 and T2. Debbie's comments about losing businesses, and I know that concern has been raised. I understand why that concern might be out there, but if you were to walk the streets and look at the properties that are T1 and T2 that haven't been developed into single family residential, what you will find are buildings that, one, I wouldn't even consider necessarily even decent quality grade for professional services, but buildings that are basically stuck in between this kind of, it doesn't make sense to renovate them or expand them to try to truly bring them up into a traditional office space or some other type of commercial building that's usable. And it doesn't make sense to sell it for redevelopment because of the zoning restrictions there. And so I welcome this conversation about figuring out a way to both incentivize, but also help it become feasible to actually build something. And we do have a missing portion, a missing middle of the housing stock that this T1, T2 solves for, even if it's just for the 3%. And I think absent any kind of change, we're going to continue to see houses that are dilapidated that are maybe sort of being used as professional services, but not necessarily. And will continue to be these pockets of underutilized properties. I think the recommendations that have been made about the height shouldn't scare anybody. It's the same height requirements that would be permitted under T1, T2. And frankly, the density next to residential neighborhoods, I do find it kind of interesting that folks have pushed back on building a more dense, higher building when, we've regularly approved mixed use projects and other zoning areas that are much more dense than what's being proposed here. And it hasn't necessarily raised the same concerns on a regular basis. I do find that interesting. I do want to clarify here, though, the maximum height in the current T1, T2 matches the maximum height that's being recommended as part of this change. Is that correct?
I believe that is true, yes.
Right, Susan? Okay.
Yeah.
So again, that doesn't necessarily concern me. Two things that do concern me, and folks have already touched on this. I do think that the setbacks and the landscape buffer are something that we need to resolve. The tree canopy piece, I think the jury's still out on that for me because I've seen and walked most of these properties, and I can't think of many that have the old growth trees, and we should certainly try to preserve those where we can. But I think most of these lots don't have the same mature trees that most of us kind of agonize over when we see older residential homes that have been torn down and something larger built in its place. I will say from a financial feasibility perspective, I'm not sure if the 50% max lot coverage makes sense when building the type of kind of infill residential that we're recommending. I don't even know if that's necessarily financially feasible. And I think that kind of going back to the cake and ingredient recipe example, I think we may need to dig into that a little bit more, because what I don't want to do or make changes that help solve for one problem, but it's still not feasible because of something else that we've baked into it that we weren't necessarily aware of. But again, I know you guys have done a lot of research and we'll be able to answer those questions. But generally, I think that this is a welcome addition. I think it helps solve for an issue that we have from a diversified housing stock perspective. I definitely think it can be done without the concern for buildings being too close to residential areas. I certainly don't think that they'll be too dense or too tall, especially using precedent as a guide. And frankly, it's going to be one of the only ways that we'll be able to improve some of the properties that are kind of stuck in time as it relates to this T1, T2, which I'll consider somewhat antiquated version of our zoning code. So those are my comments, and I appreciate the work that you guys put into it, and I welcome seeing this conversation evolve. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there other comments or questions? All right. If not, I've got a few. I do have some concerns about this. I think it is important to reach out further, as some of my colleagues have said, to neighbors, to folks who are longtime next door folks from these places. I think there is some sort of differentiation that needs to occur. For example, Park. Or I guess Great Falls or Park is what I'm thinking about. You know, you've got some properties that are really kind of embedded in a neighborhood, and there are others, as you say, on Washington that don't share the same kind of characteristics. So I think further differentiation is necessary and appropriate. I also think this is something that these decisions should stay with council. That council ought to be the decision maker and to be able to weigh the interest of neighbors and the like. And I'm not sure exactly what you have in mind by planning commission, but I feel like the planning commission it's a different body, more for kind of technical review as opposed to a review that involves neighbors and the like. And so personally, I would recommend that these kind of projects go through the city council in some form or the other. So I guess I would just say I think that we need to spend some more time on this, particularly getting our neighbors involved. I think this is a good start. I know you've spent a lot of time on this and you're extremely knowledgeable through all your years of work at Arlington County, and we benefit from that. But I think going back again to the neighbors just a bit more and some more thought on this would be helpful. So anyway, that's all I've got. Does anyone else have anything else, or should we move on to the next item? Susan, thank you again, and Paul as well. And I guess we'll be hearing more from you later on, but maybe we've given you some food for thought to consider for tonight, and you can report back after you've had a chance to digest the cake or whatever it is you happen to be forced to eat tonight. So anyway, let's keep moving and let's go on to the City Hall presentation, the plaza. Wyatt, are you going to be handling that, or who's taking that on?
I believe Jim Snyder or Paul Stoddard. I don't know which one of you all will step forward for this one.
I think Paul wanted to handle this. Paul.
Okay, super. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Mayor, Charter, members of council. I do want to acknowledge the efforts of Cameron Garris. He was the staff planner that pulled together the staff report. He is not feeling well today, and so I offered to give him a night off. So let me walk through this. So this is a request to council starting there on line 1. The request tonight is to get initial feedback from City Council on this concept design for a plaza. It's on the front corner of the City Hall area there at the intersection with Park Avenue and Little Falls Street. And also not only feedback on the design, but also direction to staff on groups to engage with, as well as timing for hopefully construction, which could proceed as early as this fall. Recommendation from staff is to move forward with generally with resources that are already available in budgets that council has previously adopted with something similar to the proposed plaza design. And really the idea here is to fulfill the requirements of the City Hall site plan, which call for construction of a plaza at that approximate location, and to start moving in the direction of this Park Avenue Great Streets concept. I'll talk about it more in the staff report, but generally the idea is to have this walkable Park Avenue Great Street that not only has wonderful civic buildings and private businesses along it, but also has a great public realm on the sidewalk and street itself, places where people can stroll, sit, gather, and find each other. Staff does recommend that at a minimum, we engage with the Rec and Parks Advisory Board, the Architectural Advisory Board, and the Planning Commission. So background, beginning on line 14, in 2017, the City Hall site plan was approved by the Planning Commission, and the approved plan sheets do show that there would be an plaza constructed at this location, and various references on the plan sheet are made to the Park Avenue Great Streets project, which was in the process of going after grant applications and getting funded. At that time, that site plan was being reviewed and acted on by the Planning Commission. Stepping backward a couple years, this is the Park Avenue a Civic Great Street study that was published in 2015, and this was done by in-house staff resources. Heather Carroll was the lead planner on that. She was an intern with the city. And one of the things she highlighted in her report after reviewing great places across the U.S., she was looking at places that had won the American Planning Association's Great Streets Award or Great Places Award. She was also looking at budget travels recommendations of great places to visit. The idea being that those are good things to mimic, look for what they're doing well and see if that can be brought into Falls Church. And one of the things she highlighted was this need for more plazas and gathering spaces along Park Avenue itself. Here, these hand-drawn sketches on lines 34 and 35 are sort of conceptual examples of what she had. The photo on the right, you can see the idea is to work with the existing sidewalks, rework the intersection geometry at the corner so that those sidewalks more fully meet the street, and then guide you into a plaza where you could sit, rest, gather, but also provide for a through space to actually walk to City Hall itself versus having to go around the landscaped yard as well as the parking lot in order to reach the front door. Going forward to line 38, this is the 2020 design. So this is what staff is proposing as the conceptual design. City staff worked with designers at the Merrifield Garden Center. They've done a variety of projects throughout the city. And really they focused on fitting together the elements that were talked about in the 2015 report provided by Ms. Carroll, as well as really focusing on ADA and working with the grades that exist on the site today. So the idea was a modest project in terms of cost, but impactful in terms of its design and its value. There are other opportunities that are in there, so it focuses on adding more seating through seating walls, benches, providing modest lighting, using retaining walls to deal with what grade is there, and then creating places for other elements, whether that's an inlaid seal, wayfinding kiosk where you could highlight nearby civic uses as well as retail uses and restaurants. You might be able to advertise upcoming city events on the board as well. And then, of course, the plaza design is flexible. If we can scroll down, and there'd also be an opportunity with thank you, with that kiosk to provide a place for remembrance. Maybe that's on a sign, maybe it's on bricks laid in the plaza itself. But this design is really designed to work with the existing grade. The existing sidewalk could remain in place, so there's minimal disruption to any ADA facilities that are out there today. And then as you can see, there's an opportunity for both sun and shade, depending on where you're sitting. And then there is a through space in the back to provide ultimately a walkway through the front lawn, if that were constructed later, up to the front door of City Hall itself. If we scroll down, staff analysis, urban design. So what this is really intended to do is take cues from recent examples. So in recent years, city staff has run a variety of pop-up events in that space, whether it's placing a couple of plastic lawn chairs out there, setting up a pumpkin maze, setting up hay bales. What we've found by observing that space, there we go. I know some of the people in those photos. What we found by setting these up is that we found that members of the community really like these things, that we've observed people walking by the site, stopping by to interact with them, stopping to sit. Just today, I saw someone enjoying the lawn, but there's no furniture out there. And so it's a difficult place to use today because of what's out there, but it's obviously a space when we set something up, people find their way to it. They stop, they sit, they talk, they enjoy. It just creates a great resting space. It's also creating that connection between downtown and City Hall as a way to sort of get through the landscaping that's there today. When you look at the additional renderings or the postcards or the drawings people have of City Hall, it's actually a pretty open view from the public sidewalk to the public building, City Hall. And so part of this would actually be making that image come back to manage the landscaping and provide that both physical connection as well as visual connection. If we scroll down to the fiscal impact section, this is, and I apologize for the rush in pulling together this staff report. We weren't able to polish this fiscal impact section as much as I would have liked, but we do have some updated numbers courtesy of our grants manager, Caitlin Sobsey. So back in 2019, the council had appropriated $240,000 in the CIP, and that was intended to be used as a local pursuing at that time. Ultimately, the city won $11 million in grant funds for the Park Avenue Great Streets project, none of which would require a local match. So that $240,000 became available for spot improvements related to the project as council had budgeted it. That total $11 million, because of the complexity of the Park Ave project that runs all the way from State Theater to the library, as well as the timing of the funding, that project isn't expected to be completed until fiscal year 2026, so several years down the road. Of that $240,000 the council had previously budgeted, looks like approximately $130,000 of it had been used for that missing link sidewalk. That piece of that important segment of the sidewalk that got installed between Cherry Hill Park and North Virginia Avenue as a response to resident requests, which leaves approximately $112,000 remaining in the project budget. So the cost estimates are good on line 79 to 80. You can see city staff has requested cost estimates from Merrifield Garden Center, depending on which features are included. Cost estimates range from $122,000 to $187,000. That estimate comes directly from Merrifield Garden Center that can not only do the design of these projects, but also handle the installation of all the features included. We'd have to double check on procurement requirements, but what's likely is that the city would need to get a quote from its job order contracting contractor, a job contractor, and hopefully that cost estimate would come back similar to what Merrifield Garden Center has already offered. But if there is a large discrepancy, I think staff would pursue further their options under procurement requirements. In terms of timing, we're here tonight for a council work session here in June. Staff would like to engage with the boards and commissions before they go on their summer recesses, so trying to get to Rec and Parks, AAB, and Planning Commission in July. Assuming positive feedback from those groups, it's conceivable that this could be constructed because of the scale of the project and the availability of local funds in the fall of this year. So it'd be a fairly short turnaround time from final design through procurement and then into construction. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Eddie?
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. I'm a big fan of this. I think in the staff report, we talked about kind of needing that civic front door. And so I really like the concept of kind of welcoming the public better to City Hall and maybe even doing some remembrance for people recently passed. My question is less about the project and actually more about the funding, because I was also confused. It sounds like, is there grant money or local dollars that it's not currently used for the Park Avenue project? What is the plan for this? Could you help me
Sure.
understand that?
So it's local dollars that are currently available. They were budgeted by council in fiscal year 2019. As you may know, or as you may be familiar with the CIP, the budget for the CIP works a little bit differently from the operating budget. That funds that are budgeted within the CIP roll over or carry forward from one year to the next, so long as there is activity on that project over a 3-year period. So there's been activity on that project, and so those funds continue to roll over and be available for use.
Got it. So it's part of the overall Park Avenue kind of Great Streets project, and it's essentially fronting the money early to do this part of it earlier.
Correct. That's and I may not have explained it well. When city staff initially requested that funding in 2019, it's because we were pursuing grants that were 80-20 grants. They required a 20% local match. We tried twice to go that route and were unsuccessful both times. But later we were available through other sources, SmartScale, which is a state-run program, as well as the NVTA's 70% regional program. Both of those required no local match, and so suddenly that $240,000 was freed up in terms of being available for spot improvements or quicker returns.
Okay.
If I could, Ms. Hard, just note that it's adopted in the CIP for the program related to the Park Avenue Great Street. So it's without rebudgeting it, it's not available to be used in another project. It could take a budget action to do that, but I just wanted to be clear, its use of this is consistent with the adopted CIP programmatic piece as well as the funding.
Got it. So you know exactly where I was going with this, Cindy. So again, practicing what we preach about equity and making sure that we evaluate decisions like this. While I'm a big fan of the City Hall Plaza and the plan for this, I want to at least make sure that we've thought through, are there other places that could use this money? So even within the Great Streets program, for example, are there poles that need to be underground on Park Avenue so that we can add a sidewalk or widen the sidewalk to make it ADA accessible? I at least want to make sure that we've done that assessment across Park Avenue or the rest of the Great Streets project before we decide on this, because while I love the idea of the plaza itself, I do want to make sure that we are practicing, again, what we preach about equity and making sure that our spending decisions are anchored in that. So that's kind of my one request. My second is, I think you've already unfortunately missed Rec and Parks. They have adjourned for the summer, so they probably won't be regrouping till September. But otherwise, I'm supportive of the plan and I really like the concept. So thank you.
All right. Other comments? Ms. Mester, do you have an additional comment?
Yes, Mayor, thank you. I just wanted to comment on the equity piece that Ms. Hardy brought up and to make sure council is aware for the Great Street Park Avenue project that Mr. Stoddard mentioned from State Theater to the library. That $11 million project includes undergrounding all of the utilities on that street and ADA accessibility. So we made sure those grant cost estimates would include all of that funding. It will pick up the 2 poles at the library that are currently still above ground, being repositioned to accommodate the library, but the conduits are already there, so we won't destroy the work that's been done. But it will have full accessibility and all undergrounding. So that equity piece was really important for those access issues.
Thank you. Vice Mayor Connolly.
I just want to say thank you for this. I like it. I didn't realize that this was part of an original plan for City Hall. It seems so long ago that we approved all those plans. So I'm glad you're bringing it to us, and I'm glad there's a way to take care of it. And I do appreciate trying to get community input and your thought that it could be some kind of remembrance and the connection between the corner and City Hall. I think that would be a really good use of space. I'm sure you're going to work with our urban forestry and trees to make sure that the trees are taken care of in that area, because as they're going down all over the city, we may as well save as many as we can on our own land in front of City Hall. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you. And just to highlight on the design, that's one of the things I like about this. This is a lighter touch in terms of a spot improvement, and we specifically designed the plaza to preserve the larger canopy trees, the more mature trees that are in the front lawn. So this actually nestles inside of that space. It would largely take the place of the existing City Hall sign, as well as the ground level plantings that are there.
That's great. Thank you for taking that into account.
Mr. Snyder?
Yes. I wanted to mention there are a couple of memos from the EDA and the Planning Commission that are a few years old, but endorse this concept, particularly trying to link the various important public investments along Park Avenue. And Paul, I believe those are included as attachments, but two of our major advisory groups have weighed in on this in the past. And it's been a few years, but I think we've attached those documents.
Thank you. The other, Mr. Snyder?
Sure, thank you. So a lot of the questions have been asked. I think preserving the trees and sort of the natural surroundings is important. I like, though, kind of making that corner more of a way station, if you will, for folks, and more inviting. I like the linkage to the business communities. And I do think I want to call attention to the Park Avenue Great Streets. That was an NVTA project, if I recall, and Cindy and I worked on that pretty hard. So it's good to see we're starting to see some tangible results. So if anyone questions the value of some of our regional work, the Park Avenue is certainly a good example, and there are many others. I would just urge that you might want to include the Historical Commission in the commissions that are invited to comment. They may have an interesting idea. I think it may follow up on a couple of the council member suggestions about remembering people that have played key roles in our community. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Other comments or questions? So I've got a few. I like in general the idea of what you're proposing. I do want to make sure it doesn't end up like a lot of these little hardscape places where they're just not that well used. They might be hot in the summer or the like. And so I would just encourage you, for example, Mr. Brown's Park, I think it's been great. And I know, Jim, you were heavily involved in that. A lot of little nooks and crannies, little things to put in there, whether it's a swing or something like that. I think just getting a little creative and get a little funky here would be a good thing to do. It looks like this is brick. I might even suggest some kind of mat, that kids can play on and run on, as opposed to, hard brickscape. But I think some whimsy, some fun, and trying to activate it in some way, maybe with art as well, and get the art folks to have a major role in this. I do think also, like, when you think about what's the most significant thing or that we do on this area, it's the farmers market certainly comes to mind. And so I would like to find a way to maybe connect it up through, I know there's grade issues, but to the parking lot somehow, so that people can circulate from the market directly in a place to eat and hang out. And it's not sort of a separate walled off space with a bunch of bushes between it and the parking lot. So if there's a way to connect it from the other side, maybe instead of 2 entries, 4 entries, so that people at the farmers market can utilize it. Maybe it's some space to sell things or to eat things or whatever. I would encourage that as well. So in general, I like it very much. I think it could benefit from some more noodling, maybe a little bit more fun and a little less formality. I think it would be the better for it. But overall, I think you're heading the right direction. Mr. Lichtenhouse?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor, I didn't get up there in time. Echoing a lot of that as well, but just in general, I want to see something that is going to be used. And this, to me, again, the concept is great, but I feel like with the hardscape, you don't really have a whole lot of uses unless it's something really formal or people are just, sitting on the benches. So I think something that's more multi-use would be great. And then I also think incorporating landscaping inside of it would make for a nicer visual than sitting staring across at somebody that's sitting on the other side of the circle if you are using the benches. So just want to find a way for this to be used as much as possible. And Mr. Brown's Park is just a great example of something that's got multi-use, multi-purpose. And this just strikes me as too formal for where and how it's probably going to be used. But in general, I definitely support improving and building a small plaza here, but just something that is more multifunctional and doesn't have such a hard edge on it.
Yeah, I think that's similar to what I said, but I would just echo that as well. I think a little less formality, a little bit more whimsy, a little bit more softer edges and softer materials, some more landscaping. It's just a little bit more fun associated with it, I think would be good. So, but I think you're heading in the right direction. Unless there's anything else, I think maybe we'll leave it at that as to this particular matter. And let's move on to our consent items. Wyatt, are you handling this, or who's handling this matter?
I will do a quick summary of these. And so our practice is to bring items that we ask council to place on the consent next week, just for a quick check-in at work session. So there are 3 items that are listed here. And the first is the purchase of 4 electric vehicles to be used by the police department. These would be vehicles actually that would be used by command staff. And we would intend to purchase those through underspending in the police department in the current fiscal year. This is intended to be a transition or sort of a platform towards moving the fleet in larger and larger numbers towards electric vehicles. And the Chevy Bolt is the solution for these for the vehicles that we're choosing here. In some respects, it's a pilot, and we hope to expand upon it. So that's the first item. The second, Cindy, do you want to just do a quick update on the WMATA Capital Finance Agreement?
Sure. So the WMATA is finally a 6-year capital financing plan that we've been working with them on instead of the 1-year renewal. This really gives us better planning, transparency, and includes a lot of the legal terms that we needed cleaned up. I want to say thank you to Carol McCrostery and Melissa Ryman for spending hours with me and the WMATA staff, DC, Maryland, and NVTC. This is consistent with the adopted budget that you did for FY22 on April 26th, and the document is included as an attachment. I just want to highlight that it has had legal review, and so staff is recommending approval of this. It is scheduled to be effective July 1st. The current CFA ends June 30th, and it's taken a lot of work to get here, but we are here, so I know it's close to the deadline, but we do recommend approval.
And then the third item for consent is the renewal of the Virginia Shared Risk Association premiums for the next year. The cost is $430,000. It's up about 2.5%. Cindy handles this as well. That's a quick summary, but if there are any questions on that, I would refer those to Cindy.
All right. Well, are there any questions? Looks like Mr. Snyder has one.
Sure, thanks. Let me go through a couple of these quickly. Electric vehicles, starting with the police. I think this is great. We heard the other day that the city had no electric vehicles, and it's good that we start to get on that that path forward, if you will. Secondly, with regard to WMATA, this is a question for Cindy. WMATA from time to time has threatened the closure of the Falls Church East Metro Station. Is there any way we can make our contribution conditional on preventing that sort of proposal? They've put it forward now twice. Federal funding has prevented it. I'm furious about it. And can we raise that in connection with this action or any other action to protect the city's interests in Metro riders?
I think legally, and I can certainly review this with Carol before this comes before you for action on next Monday, because of the compact, we probably can't tie it as strongly as capital funding or East Falls Church. We can, however, do as we've done in the past, and I just put the resolution on the screen. Council has directed staff to put some key whereases in the resolution to signify your strong intent. And I did keep what many of which we had last year when we did the amendment and updated it. So if there's something that you would like placed in the resolution, I might propose that's a place to do it. You can see we've done safety and reliability, bus and rail improvements, fair share of the operations and so forth.
I think I would request that we add, well, first of all, we see if it's possible to put in a condition in the contract itself. I rather suspect that that might be impossible to do based upon the legality of the situation, but I would certainly like to add a whereas clause that makes it very clear that proposals to shut down East Falls Church or West Falls Church station are absolutely unacceptable to us. I've said it publicly, I've said it privately, but that proposal keeps coming up as the doomsday scenario, and it's not nuanced. It's like taking a meat cleaver approach to things. So I think we need to make it clear that some of this stuff, from our perspective, is off limits. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Lichtenhouse.
Yeah, I don't want this to come across the wrong way because I drive a Ford, but why are we choosing Chevy Bolt? Just curious there.
So I would defer to the chief on that question. I know that they looked at different options. I think probably I don't think she's still on the call. The police package is I don't think there are many brands that are offering the police package at this point in the electric version. And so I think that's the short answer.
Okay. That goes to my second question is, I mean, are we, so our parking enforcement, are they going to use one of these as well? Because that's one that stood out to me immediately that would benefit from having an electric vehicle, not running idle most of the day, as much driving around as they do.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, you know, when we look across the city, I think there are lots of vehicles that will be, I think, good applications of EV, and including our building inspectors and rec and parks and others. So we'll keep pushing on this, and we can give a fuller report to council on some of the other options as we move forward.
Okay. So I don't think our PSA cars are used for much more multi-purpose than what they're used for now, correct? But I assume the chief knows what she wants. She gets it, right? So it doesn't need to.
She did work with the team to vet several options.
Disappointing it's not Ford, but I understand. It's okay.
Ms. Hardy.
Thank you. So like the others, I was really excited to see the pilot of the EVs. I won't ask about other models since Ross asked about it, but I guess when you give a mouse a cookie, they're just going to ask for a glass of milk. So I would love to know what the transition plan is for the rest of our vehicles. Maybe at a future work session. I think we've talked about that before, beyond kind of this first four. And then I had a question on operating costs, whether we have to install new chargers or whether the ones we already have at the City Hall garage and in the front will be sufficient.
The plan is to use the ones we have right now, but as we get more vehicles and sort of step this up, we will need to upgrade our charging capacity, both at the property yard and at City Hall.
So right now, I think the public is, and I think City Hall employees are really enjoying those 4 chargers out front. So if we think that these 4 new cars are going to take that up, I think we're going to anticipate some complaints or concerns.
These 4 cars will not be using the front chargers. We do have 4 chargers in the rear. And this contract that's cited here with Sourcewell contract includes EV as a competitive price, so we can do chargers. And I just wanted to take a moment to build on Mr. Shields' comments about why these vehicles, in addition to reviewing the police package and what works well with our officer needs, it was a competitive purchasing instrument that allowed us to get a very good price as well for the vehicles.
Got it. As part of that, while we're on the topic of EVs, as part of the Volkswagen settlement, are we still pursuing more public charging stations?
Right now, we have maxed out what has available under the Volkswagen settlement. The state has just opened up a competitive process for some clean school buses, so we're looking at that. But under the current Volkswagen, we've capped our grant opportunities. That said, Kate is always looking at other grants and opportunities for public and private EVs.
Great. Thank you. That's it.
All right, thank you. Any other comments about the consent agenda? I'll just echo my my support for the electric vehicles and the hope that we can get the whole fleet electric one of these days coming up in the near future. I think they offer a lot of advantages. So anyway, Ms. Mester, did you have another comment?
I just wanted to note for the consent agenda, this was later added, but you do have 2 library items, which are the annual ebooks and book purchases. So those were in your packet as well, if there was any questions or comments.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Cindy.
All right, so unless there's anything else on the consent agenda, why don't we move on to council schedule and see if there's any general council comments. Mr. Duncan?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The Council's Economic Development Committee would be scheduled to meet this Thursday at 1 o'clock. Discuss the agenda preliminarily with Becky Witzman, but I'll be doing some further running of the lines on that tomorrow. Just wondered if Letty and Ross could let me know their availability for that meeting. I'm not sure everybody's in town.
So maybe they can do that offline if they don't.
I'm good, Phil. Thanks.
Okay.
I'll be there too.
Okay. All right, good. Thank you. I'll try to get the agenda out Wednesday morning. If we moved on to other comments, I'd just like to speak to the vaccine rate question again, as I did last week. Thank the manager for assembling the advertisement in the news press last week to call attention to the importance of getting your second vaccine shot. A little distressed to see that our numbers are not rising very significantly. I think the latest report is that 56.8 of the city's population is fully vaccinated. That's up from 55.2 a week ago. Just wondering what our plan is to continue to try to beat the drum to get stragglers to participate in the vaccinations.
I think we just need to keep doing the best we can on it. I don't have any great ideas on what the city can do. I'm open to ideas that we can do. I know that Fairfax Health is still doing its outreach to try to get those populations that have the hardest time accessing it, or populations that have had the lowest uptake. But open to any ideas that council has or others.
I would also note that that the numbers that you'll see from the state don't include federal numbers. So, for example, if you work for the Secret Service and got vaccinated through the Secret Service, you're not going to turn up on the state percentage number, or if you're military or something like that. So there's a pretty significant amount of folks in Northern Virginia who've actually been vaccinated through alternative means that aren't reflected in the state numbers. So you should keep that in mind as well. So I don't know what our true number is. We had some discussion today on a regional call with the health directors as to what that number might be. Mm-hmm. They certainly believe that it's percentage points, how many they didn't speculate, but a number of percentage points higher than are reflected in the numbers that you're referring to.
So that there's not going to be a re-reckoning of those numbers. That's just always going to be a condition of the data that's reported. It's always going to be underreporting. Is that it's an undercount basically is what the belief is.
No, there will be a reckoning. It just hasn't happened, and I don't know if that's the number one priority for some of these federal agencies and the like. But there will be a reckoning. There are folks, for example, who get the first vaccine in Wisconsin, and they move here and they get the second one here, and so there's a number of reasons why the numbers can be skewed. But I think the biggest one in our region is the fact that people get their shots through the federal government or through the military because we've got such a high percentage of those folks. And the notion is that there will be a reckoning. It just hasn't happened yet.
Okay, well, that's information I did not know, so that's helpful. Thank you. I guess I would say we have council has one more meeting next Monday before the July 4th break. So when we come back in the middle of July, by then it will be. I just wonder if we will have an opportunity to hear from the Fairfax Health folks or the state folks or someone about where we go in the rest of the summer if it appears that we're stuck in the below 60s on fully vaccinated when the city of our size and education and healthiness ought to be. We ought to be leading the state. We ought to be in the 80% range, I would think.
Well, again, it may be possible we are there. I don't know, probably not, but certainly our numbers are underreported as to participation in federal or military vaccination efforts. I'm positive of that. But how much, I couldn't say, but I do think it's not insignificant given the amount of folks in our city who have those relationships.
Okay. Are we going to continue to run ads in the newspaper for the next week or so, or what's the thinking?
We will continue to run an ad next week. I'm sorry, this coming Thursday. And we are looking at ways we can target other, target communities through other weeklies, to try to get the word out. I think the youth population is also very relevant to the vaccination effort right now. And so that's a big communication effort. The schools have been very effective in that. They've been, I think they've been getting good numbers in their outreach. So, yeah, we'll keep working.
Okay.
Can I ask a follow-on question to that? I see other people have their hands up, but I can wait my turn. But I do have a
follow-up. Go ahead. Jump to the front of the line. It's no worries.
Yeah. Okay. My question is about: are we comparing apples to apples? So the message that I saw that came out today was 70% of Virginia adults 18 and older have received at least one dose. But then I look at the information that comes from in our newsletter that came out today from the communications department, which is so good and full of really good information. And as I'm looking at vaccine data, it looks like we're counting our whole entire city's population, not the population of people 18 and older. So I just want to make sure that the actual numbers are the numbers. And I don't know who makes those calculations, but if you take out the fact that we can estimate there's 2,000 people under the age of 12 who can't be vaccinated and more under the age of 18, then our percentage goes up. But I don't know if everybody's doing all numbers or just 18. So that's my question. Do you know that, Wyatt? Or can you check with Susan and Claire?
Well, in terms of it kind of depends on, there's different ways of looking at it, and I think legitimate ways to do it. In terms of the president's challenge about 70% by July 4th, I think he was referring to the above 18 population. And so Governor Northam has announced that Virginia has met that threshold. Northern Virginia has met that threshold. The city of Falls Church has met that threshold for the population above 18 having received at least one dose. So that's one way of reporting it, and that gets your number above 70%. From a public health perspective, I think they are interested in the full population. And so in our discussions with the public health experts, we are reporting out kind of that full population number because that really is the kind of the bottom line target that when people talk about herd immunity and that type of thing, it's that larger denominator that you're looking at. But 18 and older is a reasonable number as well, just because that's who's been had access to vaccine for the longest period of time. We've only gone, or 16 and older, rather, younger than that, just very, very recently. So it's a quick comment on your observation.
Thanks.
All right, let's go back in line here. Mr. Snyder.
Sure. So Phil Duncan, I think, has opened a very good line of inquiry here. Is there any sort of, can we make it easy for people to like CVS here and here and this and here and Harris Teeter and here, literally make it easy for people to know where they can go without a lot of prep time, and sort of pull it together and make it easy for people, and then potentially a pop-up clinic if we're identifying certain parts of our population that because of their work or whatever can't, Phil is absolutely right. One would expect our community, just as we lead the voting, we ought to be far ahead here. And this is not negative, and this isn't numbers. This is how do we get more people vaccinated in the city of Falls Church, whatever the numbers are, and what can we do to assist that? Anyway, I just want to follow up. I think Phil is sounding the right note here, and I just think we need to keep pressing in every way we can think about to get good information out to people, make it easy, make a pop-up clinics, if possible, available to key parts of our population that maybe are lagging the numbers. One other thing, the Falls Church News Press has communicated with us on several occasions about a longer, what should I say, business relationship, and I wonder if that can be studied and looked at, and that would provide significant communications benefits to the city that we're not otherwise getting. I think all too often, what you get about our debates or our successes in the city is a little soundbite, if even that. Is there an opportunity to provide better and more detailed information using the Falls Church News Press, if it's appropriate, to get more detailed, more conveniently out to people, and even a pro-con on some issues. So I'm just asking if it be explored, but clearly it would be an arm's length business transaction, and it would have to provide significant benefits equivalent to whatever we're paying for the additional space in the news press. And I will say that everybody gets it, and pretty much when you're walking around, everybody reads at least a few pages of it each week, from what I can tell. So just in addition to our web and every other kind of communications mechanisms that we have collectively and individually, the fact of the matter is that the news press is read, and is it a legitimate business opportunity, financial opportunity for the city to improve our communications with our citizens? Wyatt, if
we have received that latest correspondence, and I'm discussing it with our communications team about how we could sustain this, and because when you do it, you do need to provide the content on a regular basis, and so we will come back to council with a proposal on how we could sustain it and how we could pay for it, and kind of what the business proposition also would be, and then we can tee it up as a decision point.
Thanks for your work.
Ms. Hardy.
Thanks. I did want to go back to the vaccine thing. I didn't want to jump in, but I think Beth is right. There is some data here that we need to dig into a little further. So, for example, on the VDH site, which is updated daily, it does show that we're nearly at 76% of our adult population. So I think a large part of it is that we have kids that aren't yet eligible. So that's why when you look at the total population numbers, it is lower than what people think. That said, I do think that we do need to transition to kind of a more high touch and targeted outreach. So while I think newspaper ads are useful, I personally would love to see actually the ad go into Spanish and Vietnamese newspapers and not necessarily the English one, places where we know that we're not reaching that community as deeply as we'd like. I think one-on-one visits, as Joe Carter was doing in businesses and residential areas, are effective. In a lot of conversations with those high-risk areas, it's really overcoming that pre-registration concern. People don't have time to pre-register and then make an appointment later and take time from work and figure out transportation. So we need to make it easier for people. And I do think that it is going to be labor intensive to do those, but those are actually going to be the most effective. I think personally, mass ads to people aren't really going to get the information. They know about this by now. Vaccines are so prevalent that if they really wanted to get it, they get one by now. It's really making sure we reach those people who may otherwise not have time and make it convenient for them and actually do those one-on-one visits. So Wyatt, if we need community volunteers, I've had several people actually come up to me and offer help. I think people see the value of getting to herd immunity. And so if Joe and team need more manpower, I think the community be willing to do that too. So let us know how we can support them.
Ms. Hiscott?
Just a quick echo to Letty's comments. We have had groups of 20 plus people who are all willing and have a multitude of language and time to go out and do additional visits with whether it's Joe Carter or someone else on staff to do that if that's helpful. So just re-highlighting that what Letty just shared.
All right, thank you. Are there any other council schedule or general comments anyone would like to make before we adjourn? All right, is there anything else anyone would like to say? Any final words? If not, do we have a motion to adjourn? No, we're going to spend some.
Make a motion to adjourn.
All right, second. All right, the third. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right, we're adjourned. Good evening. Go do something.
All right.
Thank
All right.
you.
All right.